The first thing Everett Mercer heard that morning was a woman laughing at him. Not laughing with him, at him. And considering Everett was standing in the middle of Main Street in Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1886, holding a broken wagon wheel in one hand and a horse's reins in the other, he couldn't exactly blame her. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and wearing the expression of a man who had spent most of his life discovering that machinery had opinions of its own. The wagon had lost its wheel in front of the general store. Everett stared at it. The horse stared at him. The horse seemed considerably less surprised. "Don't," Everett muttered. The horse flicked an ear. "I know whose fault this is." The horse looked toward the sky. Everett sighed. Then the woman laughed again. She stood on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, perhaps 35, with auburn hair tucked beneath a modest traveling hat and a pair of gloves folded neatly in one hand. She had been watching him wrestle with the wheel for several minutes. Everett straightened slowly. "Something amusing, ma'am?" "Only the part where you threatened the horse." "I wasn't threatening him." "You said you knew whose fault it was." "I did." "And?" Everett looked at the horse. The horse looked back. "He's thinking about it." She laughed again. This time Everett nearly smiled. Nearly. Her name was Margot Whitcomb. Though Everett would not learn that for another 10 minutes. She had arrived in Council Bluffs less than a month earlier from Illinois to help her widowed aunt operate a small boarding house near Broadway. She had also acquired the dangerous habit of saying exactly what she thought. Everett noticed that before he noticed anything else. He also noticed that she looked at him differently from the way most younger women looked at older men. There was no pity, no polite smile reserved for someone's grandfather. Just curiosity. She stepped off the boardwalk. "You're going to need a new spoke." "I know. You've been staring at that wheel for 5 minutes." "I was considering my options." "Your options appear to be staring and muttering." "That did it." Everett smiled. Margot saw it, and something about her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. For a man who had spent the better part of 12 years avoiding anything that might disturb the careful quiet of his life, that tiny change should have been warning enough. But Everett Mercer had never been particularly good at recognizing warnings, until after they had already passed. He eventually fixed the wagon. Margot helped hold the lantern. They spoke for perhaps 7 minutes. 7 ordinary minutes. Except Everett thought about them for the rest of the day. And that, as he would later admit, was where his trouble began. Everett Mercer had spent 12 years making his life predictable. He woke before sunrise, checked the horses, walked the boundary of his property outside Council Bluffs, ate breakfast alone, worked until supper, read the newspaper afterward, usually without remembering what he had read. Then bed. It was not a miserable life. That was the problem. Miserable lives invite change. Everett's was merely quiet. His wife Beatrice had died years earlier after a long illness, leaving behind an empty chair at the kitchen table and a silence Everett had gradually learned to treat like furniture. He did not talk about her much. People assumed that meant he had moved on. They were wrong. He had simply learned how to carry grief without making noise. Then Margot Whitcomb began appearing around town. At first, Everett told himself it was coincidence. She bought flour from the same general store. Coincidence. She stopped at the blacksmith while he was there. Coincidence. She happened to walk past the livery stable just as Everett was saddling his horse. An unusually persistent coincidence. You seem to be everywhere, Everett remarked one afternoon. Margot looked at him innocently. So do you. I live here. So do I. You've been here 3 weeks. 4? That doesn't make it better. She smiled. Everett had begun discovering something inconvenient about Margot. She enjoyed making him smile. And worse, he enjoyed letting her. One afternoon, she arrived at his ranch, carrying a small parcel. I was told you know horses. Who told you that? Everyone. Everyone talks too much. They do. She held out the parcel. Inside was a brass buckle that had broken from her uncle's old saddle. I wondered if you could fix it. Everett examined it. Could. Will you? He looked at her. Probably. That's almost enthusiasm. It isn't, she smiled. He repaired the buckle before sunset. When she returned to collect it, she found him sitting on the porch with 2 cups beside him. Everett noticed her looking. He looked at the cups, then at her. I made too much coffee. Margot raised an eyebrow. For one man? Everett cleared his throat. I misjudged the amount. Of course. She sat down. Neither mentioned the second cup again. But something had shifted. Margot asked about the ranch. Everett asked about her aunt's boarding house. She told him about a guest who snored loudly enough to frighten the chickens. He told her about a horse that had once escaped and spent half a day standing outside the sheriff's office as though reporting himself. She laughed so hard she had to put down her cup. Everett watched her, and for the first time in years, his house did not feel too quiet. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the gate. Mr. Mercer? Yes? You know, you look younger when you laugh. Everett frowned. That's a strange thing to tell a man. Perhaps. She walked away smiling. Everett watched until she disappeared down the road. Then he looked at the empty cup beside his own. He shook his head. Trouble, he muttered. The horse in the pasture lifted its head. Everett pointed at it. Don't start. By the second week, Everett had developed a habit he refused to call a habit. On Thursdays, he found reasons to ride into Council Bluffs. He needed nails, then lamp oil, then a new leather strap, then, inexplicably, 3 pounds of coffee when he still had nearly 2 pounds at home. The general storekeeper, Edmund Harrow, noticed. Edmund noticed everything. You buying coffee for the whole county now? He asked. Everett looked at him. No. Shame. I was about to offer you a discount. Everett took the coffee. Put it on my account. Already did. Everett paused. Edmund grinned. She was here yesterday. Everett frowned. Who? Edmund's grin widened. Interesting question. Everett walked out. Unfortunately, Margot was standing across the street. She lifted a hand. Everett nodded. That should have been the end of it. Instead, she crossed the road. I've been looking for you. I've been here. That isn't what I meant. Everett looked around as though someone else might be involved. Margot smiled. My aunt needs firewood. I'll send some. I know. She paused. I was hoping you'd bring it. Everett studied her. You have men in town who sell firewood. I know. Some are younger. I know. And cheaper. I know. Everett scratched his jaw. You enjoy making things difficult. No, Margot said. I enjoy seeing whether you'll do something simply because I asked. That answer followed him all the way back to the ranch. He delivered the wood that afternoon. Margot came outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. Everett stopped. "You're learning." "I pay attention." He accepted the cup. That was when Harlan Pike, a prosperous rancher in his early 40s, rode up the road and stopped near the fence. Harlan had been courting Margot since she arrived. He was handsome, wealthy, and possessed of the confidence of a man who had never had to wonder whether a door would open for him. He looked from Margot to Everett, then to the coffee. "Didn't know you had company." Margot answered before Everett could. "I do." Harlan smiled thinly. "Mr. Mercer is considerably older than you." Everett's shoulders tightened. Margot looked at Harlan. "I noticed." Harlan laughed awkwardly. "I only mean you might have more in common with someone closer to your age." Margot set her cup down. "Perhaps." Then she looked at Everett. "But I don't recall asking anyone to choose for me." Harlan's smile disappeared. Everett said nothing. He simply watched Margot. Something in her voice had changed. She wasn't defending him. She was defending her right to decide. Harlan eventually rode away. Margot picked up her coffee. "Well?" Everett looked toward the road. "Well?" She smiled. "You didn't say anything." "I was trying not to make it worse." "Did it work?" "No idea." Margot laughed, and Everett realized something he had been trying very hard not to realize. He was beginning to care what happened next. The trouble with being 61, Everett decided, was that a man had too much experience remembering how things could go wrong. A younger man might see Margot sitting beside him on the porch and think only about the moment. Everett thought about tomorrow, and next year, and the year after that. He thought about the years between them. He thought about what people in town would say. Most of all, he thought about Margot waking one morning and realizing she had mistaken comfort for love. So he began pulling away. Not dramatically. Everett was too old for dramatic. He simply stopped going into town on Thursdays. He stopped leaving the second cup on the table. When Margot visited, he became polite. Too polite. She noticed by the third visit. "You've changed." "No. You have." "I'm tired." "You've been tired for 20 years." Everett looked at her. She folded her hands. "Did I do something?" "No." "Then why are you treating me like a guest?" He looked toward the pasture. Because he knew the answer, and because saying it aloud made it real. "You're young, Margot." She waited. "I'm not. I've noticed." He almost smiled, but didn't. "You've got years ahead of you. So do you. Not the same number." "No." Her voice softened. "But why do you keep counting?" That landed harder than Everett expected. He stood. Margot watched him. "I've lived long enough to know that some things aren't meant for me anymore." "Who told you that?" "No one." "Then you're the one doing it." Everett looked at her. She continued quietly. "You've decided that because you've lost someone, you aren't allowed to find happiness again." He said nothing. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The wind moved across the pasture. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Everett finally said the thing he had been avoiding. "You're too young for an old cowboy like me." Margot's expression softened. Not with pity. Something else. She stepped closer. "Everett, you keep saying that as though I'm asking you to give me a number." He looked confused. "I'm asking you to give me yourself." He stared at her. She smiled faintly. "You think I don't know your age?" "No." "You think I don't see the gray in your hair?" No. You think I came here because I couldn't find a younger man? Everett looked away. Margot stepped closer. I came here because I found a man who listens when people speak. She paused. A man who fixes things instead of complaining about them. Another pause. And a man who pretends he made too much coffee because he's terrified I'll notice he was hoping I'd come. Everett's mouth twitched. You noticed. Immediately. For the first time, Everett laughed. Margot looked directly at him. That's the man I see. Everett swallowed. And what do you see when you look at the rest? The rest? The years. She considered that. I see a life you've already lived. Then she smiled. And I see a life you haven't lived yet. Everett had no answer. For once, the old cowboy who always knew what to say simply stood there. Margot picked up her shawl. I'll come Tuesday. She walked toward the gate, then turned. And Everett? Yes? Don't spend 3 days deciding whether Tuesday is allowed. She smiled. I've already decided. Then she left him standing in the yard. Everett watched her disappear. And for the first time since Beatrice died, he wondered whether the future might still have something waiting for him. Not because he was young, but because perhaps he had finally stopped using age as an excuse not to live. Everett did not sleep particularly well that night. This was inconvenient. He had spent 12 years sleeping like a man who had nothing left to anticipate. Now his mind had apparently decided to become 20 years younger and considerably more troublesome. He thought about Margot's words. I came here because I found a man who listens. He thought about the way she had looked at him. Not at his gray hair, not at the years between them, at him. By Tuesday afternoon, Everett had made a decision. He would stop running. He was still working out exactly what that meant when Margot arrived at the ranch. She found him repairing a gate. You came, he said. I said I would. I wasn't sure. That's because you have an unfortunate relationship with hope. Everett smiled. Probably. She stood beside the fence. For a while, they watched the horses. Then Margot said, There's something I haven't told you. Everett stopped working. That sounds serious. It is. She took a breath. Before coming to Iowa, Margot had been engaged. His name was Frederick Langley, a respectable businessman from St. Louis. He had money, connections, and a future that looked excellent on paper. Everyone thought I was fortunate, she said. Were you? No. She looked down. I was going to marry him because it made sense. Everett leaned against the fence. What happened? I left. Why? Because I woke up one morning and realized I was about to spend the rest of my life explaining to myself why I was happy. Everett considered that. That's a poor way to live. I thought so. She looked at him. So I came here. To Iowa? To my aunt. I needed somewhere quiet enough to hear myself think. Everett nodded. And then? Margot smiled. Then I met a stubborn cowboy who thinks being old is a permanent condition. Everett laughed. 61 isn't old. That's what I keep telling you. No, I know what you mean. She stepped closer. I didn't come here looking for a husband. Everett's expression fell slightly. Margot noticed. But I didn't come here expecting to find someone I could imagine building a life with either. That stopped him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Everett reached for her hand. It was the smallest gesture. No grand speech. No dramatic declaration. Just an old cowboy taking the hand of a woman who had decided she would rather choose her own future than accept the one other people had chosen for her. And neither of them noticed the rider approaching from the road. Not until Everett looked up. It was Harlan Pike, and he was carrying a letter. Harlan Pike stopped at the gate and removed his hat. He looked uncomfortable. That alone concerned Everett. Harlan was not a man who looked uncomfortable unless circumstances had become unusually unpleasant. "I brought this for you," he said to Margot. She stared at the envelope. Her face changed. Everett noticed immediately. "You know him?" he asked. Margot nodded. "Harlan knows my aunt." Harlan held out the letter. "It came through town this morning." Margot took it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Frederick Langley, the man she had left in St. Louis. She opened the letter. Everett watched her eyes move across the page. When she finished, she folded it carefully. "What does he want?" Everett asked. "Me to come back." Harlan shifted in his saddle. "He says he's willing to forget what happened." Margot looked almost amused. "How generous." Everett said nothing. But something cold had entered his chest. He had spent years believing he was too old to compete with younger men. Now here was a younger man offering Margot a life Everett could not provide. Money, travel, comfort, a house in the city, everything respectable, everything easy. Everett looked at Margot. "Perhaps you should go." She stared at him. "What?" "If that's what you want, it isn't. You should still consider it." Her expression hardened. "Why?" "Because I don't want you waking up 10 years from now wishing you'd taken the easier road." Margot stepped toward him. "You think you're being noble?" "I think I'm being practical." "No." She shook her head. "You're being afraid." Everett flinched. Harlan quietly looked toward the road, suddenly fascinated by absolutely nothing. Margot continued, "You don't get to decide what I might regret. I only want what's best for you." "No, Everett." Her voice softened. "You want to protect yourself from being chosen." That sentence silenced him. She looked at the letter, then tore it in half. Harlan's eyebrows rose. Margot tore it again, then again. She dropped the pieces into the dirt. "I already chose." Everett stared at her. "You don't have to prove anything to me." "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" "Choosing the life I actually want." She reached for his hand. Everett looked down at their joined hands. He had spent years believing love belonged to the young, to people with decades ahead of them and fewer reasons to be afraid. But perhaps love did not ask how many years remained. Perhaps it simply asked whether two people were brave enough to use the years they had. Harlan cleared his throat. "I suppose congratulations are in order." Margot smiled. "Not yet." Everett looked at her. She looked back. "He's still thinking." Harlan laughed. Everett shook his head. "Apparently everyone has noticed that." "Yes," Margot said. "Everyone except you." For the first time, Everett did not argue. He simply squeezed her hand. And somewhere behind them, one of the horses gave a loud snort. Margot glanced toward the pasture. "Even the horses are impatient." Everett smiled. "Then we'd better stop wasting their time." The following Saturday, Everett rode into Council Bluffs without a shopping list. This was unusual enough that Edmund Harrow nearly dropped the ledger he was holding. "No coffee?" "No." "No nails?" "No." "Then you've either lost your mind or finally found it." Everett looked at him. "I'm going to the schoolhouse." Edmund slowly smiled. Ah. Everett pointed a finger at him. Don't. I haven't said anything. You were about to. I was about to say congratulations. Everett considered that. You're getting ahead of yourself. Edmund leaned against the counter. Everett, you've been riding around this town for 3 weeks, looking like a man arguing with his own shadow. I've been thinking. Exactly. Everett left before the conversation became more humiliating. At the schoolhouse, Margot was sitting at her desk sorting papers. She looked up, then looked at the calendar. It's Saturday. I know. You don't come here on Saturdays. I know. She smiled. Then something must be terribly wrong. Everett removed his hat. Something is. She waited. He stood there for several seconds. Then he laughed at himself. I had this speech. What happened to it? I forgot it. That's probably for the best. Everett walked closer. I've spent most of my life believing a man should know when to stop reaching for things. Margot listened. I thought age taught you that. It teaches you many things, such as that losing someone can make you afraid to love again. Her expression softened. And that being afraid can disguise itself as wisdom. Margot stood. Everett reached into his coat. His hand emerged holding a small wooden box. Margot looked at it. Everett. I found this in a drawer. He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold band that had belonged to Beatrice. Margot's eyes filled with emotion. I don't want to replace anything, Everett said. I couldn't. I know. But I don't want the rest of my life to be a monument to what I've lost. Margot reached for his hand. I don't want to replace anything either. He looked at her. I want to build something new. Everett swallowed. Then marry me. No flourish, no rehearsed speech, just the truth. Margot smiled through tears. You finally got there. He frowned. Got where? To the answer. She took the ring. Yes. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the schoolhouse windows. Everett smiled. That was easier than I expected. Margot laughed. No, it wasn't. And for once, Everett admitted she was right. News traveled through Council Bluffs faster than a prairie fire. By Monday morning, everyone knew. By Tuesday, everyone had an opinion. By Wednesday, several people had improved upon the facts. Edmund Harrow claimed Everett had proposed in the middle of a thunderstorm. The barber said it happened in a schoolhouse during a blizzard. The woman who ran the boarding house across from the livery insisted Margot had proposed first. None of them had been there. This did not slow anyone down. Everett found the attention exhausting. Margot found it entertaining. At the general store, an elderly customer looked at Everett over a sack of flour. You're really marrying that young woman? Everett nodded. I am. She's 35. I know. You're 61. I know that too. The man shook his head. Young people these days. Everett stared at him. The man stared back. Neither noticed the absurdity. Margot, standing nearby, nearly laughed herself breathless. But not everyone was pleased. Harlan Pike approached Everett outside the livery. I owe you an apology. Everett looked at him. For what? For thinking age made you less of a man. Everett considered that. Age does make some things harder. Harlan nodded. But it doesn't make a man less worthy. Everett extended his hand. Harlan shook it. Then Harlan grinned. Although I still think you take too long to make decisions. Everett sighed. You're beginning to sound like Margot. That's because she's usually right. Everett disliked this considerably. He went home that evening to find Margot sitting on the porch. She had brought a small suitcase. Everett looked at it. "What's that?" "My things." "You've been here 10 minutes." "I know. You're moving in?" She smiled. "Unless you've changed your mind." Everett looked at the suitcase, then at her, then back at the suitcase. "No." Margot raised an eyebrow. "No, what?" "No, I haven't changed my mind." She stood. "Good." They carried the suitcase inside. The house looked exactly the same. The table was the same. The chairs were the same. The old stove still complained when it heated. But something had changed. The silence had. It no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like a pause between conversations. That evening, Margot opened a cupboard and discovered Everett had exactly one plate he considered good enough for company. "How many guests have you had?" "Not many. I can see that." She found 2 mismatched cups. Everett looked embarrassed. Margot smiled. "We'll fix this." "We?" "Yes." She began rearranging the kitchen. Everett watched. For years he had protected his life from change because change had once taken something from him. Now change was standing in his kitchen, moving his cups around, and telling him his shelves were poorly organized. And somehow, he had never felt safer. That night, they sat together on the porch. Margot rested her head against his shoulder. Everett looked toward the dark fields. "I thought my life was finished." She lifted her head. "It wasn't finished." He smiled. "No, it was waiting." Everett took her hand. And for a man who had spent 12 years believing the best chapters of his life were already behind him, that was perhaps the greatest surprise of all. Everett Mercer used to believe that a man's life could be measured by the years behind him. At 61, he thought he understood the arithmetic. The years he had worked, the years he had loved, the years he had lost, the years he had spent alone. He had quietly placed each one where it belonged and decided the important part was finished. He was wrong. 3 years after Margot moved into his home, Everett stood on the porch one summer evening, watching her teach their young son, Arthur, how to whistle. Arthur was terrible at it. The sound he produced was somewhere between a wounded bird and a kettle with a personal grievance. Everett covered his ears. Margot laughed. "You were worse." "I was never that bad." "You were." Arthur tried again. This time the sound was louder. Everett looked at the boy. "That's an improvement." Margot smiled. "You said that last time." "I was being encouraging. You were being diplomatic. There's a difference." "There is." She sat beside him. The fields stretched toward the horizon, golden beneath the evening sun. Everett looked at the house behind them. There were children's boots by the door now, books on the table, a second rocking chair, 2 cups beside the coffee pot every morning. Small evidence of a life that had once seemed impossible. Margot leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what you said?" "What?" "That I was too young for an old cowboy." Everett laughed. "I was an idiot." "You were cautious." "I was an idiot." She smiled. "Both can be true." He looked toward Arthur, who was now trying to teach the family dog to whistle. The dog looked deeply offended. Everett shook his head. "I spent 12 years thinking I was protecting myself." "You were." "From happiness." Margot was quiet. Then she took his hand. Sometimes people mistake an ending for a verdict. Everett looked at her. She continued, "Something ends, and they decide that means nothing good can follow." He squeezed her hand. "But life doesn't work that way." No, it didn't. Everett had learned that a person could lose something precious and still have room for something beautiful. He had learned that age could change a man's body without diminishing his capacity to laugh, to hope, to care, or to begin again. Most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the future arrived looking nothing like the future a person had imagined. For Everett, it had arrived in a woman standing outside a general store, laughing at a broken wagon wheel. He had thought she was laughing at him. Maybe she was. But she had also seen something in him that he had stopped seeing himself. That was the strange mercy of being truly known. Sometimes another person notices the life still inside you before you have the courage to notice it yourself. Everett leaned back in his chair. Margot rested her head against him. Arthur's terrible whistle sounded across the yard. Everett smiled. "He's getting better." Margot laughed. "Now you're definitely lying." Everett looked at her. "I've got years of practice." And there, on an Iowa porch beneath a fading summer sky, the old cowboy who once believed his best days were gone discovered something better than youth. He discovered that a life can begin again without pretending the earlier chapters never happened. If this story reminded you that you are never too old for a new chapter, subscribe now. There are more stories waiting for you. Stories about second chances, unexpected love, and the people who discover that their lives weren't finished after all.